They didn't put my name on the seating chart. I realized it standing in the foyer of my brother's wedding venue, the kind of place designed to make people feel important just for being invited. Marble floors reflected the chandelier light, and laughter echoed softly off glass walls. Guests moved past me in silk dresses and tailored suits, all of them certain of where they belonged. I wasn't. I leaned closer to the framed chart, scanning it again, then again, my finger tracing names I knew by heart. Parents. Close family. Friends. My brother Daniel's name appeared everywhere, bold and centered. Mine was nowhere. Not misspelled. Not misplaced. Just absent. When I finally asked the coordinator, my voice came out smaller than I expected. She leaned in, polite and efficient, until her smile faltered just enough to tell me the truth before she spoke it. "Oh," she said quietly, like she hoped I wouldn't hear. "You're not listed." The words hovered between us, light at first, then suddenly heavy. Not listed. As if I had never existed. I told her I was Daniel's sister, offering the information the way someone offers proof of purchase, hoping it might fix something. Her eyes widened with recognition, followed by that soft, apologetic look people use when a mistake has already gone too far to undo. She disappeared briefly and came back with a folding chair half open in her hands, already resigned to the solution. "We can seat you near the service hallway," she said, lowering her voice. "Just for the ceremony." I nodded before my mind caught up. That reflex was old. Agree quickly. Don't cause trouble. Don't take space. The service hallway was narrow and cold, tucked behind the glass ballroom like an afterthought. It smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and starch. A coat rack lined one wall, heavy with expensive jackets, and my folding chair sat just out of sight of the main room. From there, I could hear the violins warming up, the low hum of anticipation, the quiet electricity of people about to witness something important. I set my gift carefully on the floor beside the chair and smoothed my dress, a muted blue I'd chosen because it wouldn't draw attention. Something safe. Something invisible. I told myself, the way I always had, that it was fine. I didn't need to be seen. I was used to this. Through the glass wall, I could see my family gathering near the fireplace. My mother adjusted Daniel's cufflinks with trembling fingers, her face soft with pride. My father laughed too loudly at something the bride's father said, clapping him on the shoulder like they'd always known each other. Daniel stood in the center of it all, relaxed, glowing, exactly where he belonged. No one was looking toward the hallway. No one was wondering where I was. The realization settled quietly in my chest. They weren't forgetting me today. This was simply how things had always been. Growing up, my mother used to call me the easy one.
Daniel was sensitive, she said.
He needed encouragement, reassurance, praise. I was strong, independent. I understood things without being told. When he cried, they rushed to him. When I stayed quiet, they smiled and told me how mature I was. Silence became my skill. I learned it at the dinner table when Daniel talked over me, and no one noticed. I learned it at school events when my parents arrived late for mine, but early for his. I learned it in the way relatives asked about his future, while nodding politely at mine. Independent meant invisible. Invisible meant convenient. The ceremony began without me. I listened as the officiant welcomed everyone, his voice warm and practiced, echoing through walls never meant to separate family. Applause rippled through the room when Daniel appeared, and I imagined him standing tall at the altar, confident, adored. For a brief moment, I wondered if he had noticed the empty space where I should have been. The thought didn't last long. Deep down, I already knew the answer. I stayed seated when the guests stood to applaud, my hands folded neatly in my lap, my chest tight but my face calm. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, heels clicking with familiarity. I looked up to see my mother approaching, her expression carefully composed. "There you are," she said softly, like I'd wandered off on purpose. Her eyes flicked to the folding chair, then away again. "This isn't ideal," she added, lowering her voice, "but please don't make this about you today. Daniel's under a lot of stress." I wanted to ask her when it would ever be about me, when I would stop being the one who understood, the one who stayed quiet, the one who made it easier for everyone else. Instead, I nodded. She squeezed my arm briefly, not comfort so much as instruction, and disappeared back into the light. Dinner followed the ceremony, though it barely touched me. Servers carried plates past the hallway, steam rising, the smell of rosemary and butter making my stomach ache. No one brought me a place setting. A waiter nearly tripped over my chair and startled when he saw me sitting there. "Family?" he asked, half apologetic, half curious. I smiled thinly and said, "Something like that." He nodded, already moving on. Everyone inside had somewhere to be. I stayed where I was. At some point, I stood and stepped closer to the doorway. Inside, the reception hall glowed under chandeliers, laughter spilling freely. Daniel sat at the head table with his new wife, my parents on either side. There was an empty chair at the far end, and used untouched. I wondered how long it would take before someone noticed if I sat there. I wondered how long before someone asked me to move. The answer came quietly, fully formed, without bitterness. I didn't want to find out anymore. I looked down at the gift beside my chair. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't flashy. But it was heavy in a way that had nothing to do with its weight. I realized then that I had spent my entire life waiting to be noticed by people who had never really looked at me. Sitting in that hallway, surrounded by coats and silence, something shifted. I wasn't forgotten. I was erased. And for the first time, I understood that fixing that wasn't my responsibility. They used to tell me I was lucky. That was the word my relatives reached for whenever the conversation drifted toward my childhood, as if luck had anything to do with being quiet enough not to cause inconvenience. "You were so easy," my mother would say, smiling like it was a compliment. "You never demanded anything." She said it proudly, the way other parents bragged about trophies or scholarships. I learned early that being low maintenance earned approval. So I became small in ways that didn't show. I learned to fold myself into corners of rooms, to listen more than I spoke, to finish my sentences in my head instead of out loud. While Daniel was encouraged to dream loudly, I was taught to be grateful silently. When we were children, the difference between us was subtle enough to be deniable. Daniel cried, and someone always came running. I fell and scraped my knee, and I was told to brush it off. When he forgot his homework, my mother marched to school with an excuse. When I stayed up late finishing mine, no one noticed. On birthdays, his cakes were elaborate, themed, photographed from every angle. Mine were smaller, quieter affairs, candles blown out quickly before the attention drifted back to him. If I ever looked disappointed, my father would laugh and say, "You don't need all that fuss." At the time, I believed him. It took years to understand that what I didn't need, according to them, was to be seen. By the time we reached high school, the roles were firmly set. Daniel was charismatic, popular, effortlessly confident. Teachers adore him. Coaches praised him. My parents attended his games religiously, sitting front row in matching jackets. I sat alone at debate competitions and award ceremonies, scanning the crowd for familiar faces that never appeared. When I brought home certificates, I laid them on the kitchen counter, hoping someone might ask. Most of the time, they ended up under mail and grocery lists. If I mentioned feeling overlooked, my mother frowned and told me not to be dramatic. "You know how your brother is," she'd say. "He just needs more." The implication was clear. I should need less. College was supposed to be my escape. I chose a school far enough away that coming home required planning, not obligation. Daniel stayed close, enrolled in a prestigious program my parents talked about endlessly. At family gatherings, they asked him about his professors, his internships, his future. When someone turned to me, it was usually to ask if I was eating enough or if I'd met anyone special yet. My accomplishments became background noise, polite nods before the conversation circled back to him. I learned to stop offering details. It was easier that way. It was during my second year of college that I realized how deeply the pattern ran. I'd come home for Thanksgiving, and the house smelled like burnt pie crust and lemon cleaner, the same way it always had. While my mother fussed over Daniel's travel delays, she asked me to grab something from her bedroom. In her nightstand drawer, I found a small stack of notebooks tied with ribbon. Curiosity got the better of me. I opened one. Every page was dated, every entry meticulous. Daniel's first day of kindergarten. Daniel's first goal. Daniel's college acceptance. Years of his life documented in careful handwriting. I flipped through all of them, faster and faster, my chest tightening with each page. There wasn't a single mention of me. Not my birthdays. Not my graduations. Not even my name. When I asked my mother about it, she didn't look surprised. She smiled, almost indulgently, and said, "You never needed things like that. You were always fine." That was the moment something cracked inside me. I understood then that there are two kinds of forgetting. One is accidental. The other is deliberate. I had been erased so thoroughly that my absence felt normal to them. After college, I built a life, quietly. I moved to a small apartment, took a job that paid the bills, and poured myself into work that mattered to me, even if it didn't impress anyone else. Over time, I helped grow a nonprofit focused on community outreach, something Daniel once referred to as a cute side project. I didn't correct him. I didn't tell him how many people relied on that work, how many nights I stayed late making sure it survived. I had learned by then that sharing my wins only gave others a chance to diminish them. Daniel, meanwhile, rose quickly. Promotions came easily. My parents boasted about his success to anyone who would listen. They began relying on him more and more, especially when it came to finances. "He's good with numbers," my father said proudly. "He handles things for us now." The trust in his voice was absolute. I said nothing. Silence had kept the peace before. I assumed it always would. The truth revealed itself by accident. One afternoon, my father asked if I could help organize some paperwork while Daniel was out of town. I sat at the dining table surrounded by folders, statements spread out like a puzzle. At first, nothing seemed wrong. Then I noticed small inconsistencies. Withdrawals that didn't match expenses. Transfers that led nowhere. I checked again, then again, my pulse quickening. The pattern was subtle, but unmistakable. Money was missing. Not enough to trigger alarms. Just enough to be hidden. I didn't want to believe it. I spent hours cross-referencing, hoping I'd made a mistake. I hadn't. When I finally confronted Daniel, it was over coffee, away from our parents. I spoke carefully, choosing my words the way I always had. He listened, then laughed softly, like I'd misunderstood a joke. "You worry too much," he said. "You don't get how this stuff works." When I pushed, his smile hardened. "Drop it," he told me. "Why cause problems? No one's going to believe you anyway." There was no anger in his voice, just certainty. I stayed quiet, not because I agreed with him, but because I knew how the story would end. I was the difficult one when I spoke up, the jealous sister, the one who couldn't just be happy. So I gathered what I could quietly. Copies, screenshots, records. I didn't plan to use them. I just needed to know the truth existed somewhere, even if no one else wanted to see it. When Daniel announced his engagement, my parents were overjoyed. Plans moved quickly. Venues were booked. Guest lists finalized. I watched from the sidelines, invited but peripheral, included but never central. By the time the wedding arrived, I had already accepted my place in the background. Or so I thought. Sitting in that service hallway on the day of the ceremony, listening to music meant for people who mattered, I felt the weight of everything I had swallowed over the years. Every dismissal, every silence, every time I'd been told I was fine. And in that quiet space, something shifted. I realized I wasn't protecting them anymore. I was protecting the lie that kept me small. That was when I understood the gift beside my chair wasn't just a gesture. It was a choice. And for the first time in my life, I was ready to make one for myself. I hadn't always planned to do anything with what I knew. For a long time, the truth sat in a folder on my laptop like something radioactive, dangerous to touch, even more dangerous to release. I told myself I was holding on to it out of responsibility, not fear. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment, though I didn't know what that meant. In reality, I was still the same person I'd always been, measuring my worth against how little disruption I caused. Knowing the truth didn't immediately make me brave. It just made me tired. In the months leading up to the wedding, Daniel became even more confident, almost buoyant. He talked about his future like it was already secured, like nothing could touch him. My parents listened with the same reverence they always had, nodding, smiling, deferring. Sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, I noticed the way his expression changed, the ease with which he dismissed concerns. The quiet entitlement that had grown unchecked for years. It struck me then how much space he had always been given to fail safely, to experiment without consequences, while I had learned to be careful with every step. We had been raised in the same house, but not in the same reality. I tried once more to give him an out. It was subtle, the way everything between us had always been. A comment about responsibility. A question about long-term planning. He brushed it off effortlessly, his tone almost affectionate. "You worry too much," he said again, like it was a running joke between us. "Relax. Everything's handled." The finality in his voice told me this wasn't about misunderstanding. It was about power. He knew exactly how protected he was. As the wedding approached, my mother called more frequently, not to ask how I was, but to remind me of schedules, expectations, boundaries. "Just be supportive," she said. "This day isn't about old issues." Old issues. As if neglect had an expiration date. As if silence erased history. Each call left me feeling smaller, more compressed, like I was being packed away neatly, so I wouldn't interfere with the picture they were all trying to maintain. The gift began as an idea I didn't want to name. I told myself it was symbolic, something meaningful, something that showed effort. Late at night, after work, I sat at my kitchen table assembling it piece by piece. Photos I'd saved over the years. Letters I'd written and never sent. Moments that mattered to me even if they hadn't mattered to anyone else. It felt strange, documenting my own life like that, as if I were creating proof that I had been here. Each page was quiet, deliberate.
No accusations. No commentary.
Just facts. Just existence. Adding the evidence came later. I remember the exact moment I decided. It wasn't dramatic. I was standing in line at the grocery store, watching a couple argue softly over which brand of cereal to buy. The ordinariness of it hit me. How people assumed fairness was the default. How they trusted the systems around them until something broke. I realized then that my parents trusted Daniel the same way, blindly, completely. Not because he deserved it more, but because they had never learned to question him. If the truth was ever going to surface, it wouldn't be because I demanded it. It would be because it was placed gently where it could no longer be ignored. The night before the wedding, I barely slept. Not out of nerves, exactly, but out of clarity. For the first time, I wasn't rehearsing conversations in my head, wasn't imagining how I might explain myself or defend my choices. I understood something fundamental had already changed. Whether or not anyone ever acknowledged it, I was done shrinking. The outcome didn't need to be dramatic. It just needed to be honest. Sitting in the service hallway on the day of the wedding, the gift beside me, I felt that calm settle fully into place. The music inside swelled and faded. Laughter rose and fell. None of it touched me anymore. I wasn't waiting to be invited in. I wasn't waiting for permission. I stood, picked up the album, and felt its weight in my hands, solid and real. This wasn't revenge in the way people imagine it, fueled by anger or spectacle. This was correction. A quiet adjustment to a story that had been told wrong for too long. Walking into the reception hall felt strangely ordinary. No one looked at me twice. I moved through the room the way invisible people always do, unnoticed, uninterrupted. The gift table stood near the wall, crowded with boxes wrapped in expensive paper, bows layered thickly on top. I placed my album carefully at the center, my name written clearly on the tag, not hidden, not apologetic. For a moment, I stood there, breathing, letting myself exist fully in that space. Then I turned and walked away. I didn't rush. I didn't hesitate. I passed my parents without stopping, past Daniel without meeting his eyes. If they noticed me at all, they gave no sign. By the time I reached the doors, the band was tuning up, the room alive with anticipation. I stepped outside into the cold mountain air and felt something loosen inside my chest, like a knot finally giving way. I hadn't heard the moment the gift was opened, but I didn't need to. I knew how truth worked. It didn't announce itself. It waited patiently until someone was ready to see it. As I walked down the long driveway, gravel crunching under my shoes, I understood that whatever happened next no longer belonged to me. I had carried the weight long enough. Now it was theirs to hold. I was already halfway down the drive when the music inside changed. I didn't hear it clearly, not at first, just a subtle thinning, like a song losing confidence. The estate glowed behind me, windows lit warm against the dark mountains, everything still looking perfect from the outside. I paused near my car, keys cold in my hand, and waited. Not because I needed to see what would happen, but because some part of me understood this was the moment I had been carrying for years. Truth doesn't rush. It arrives when it's ready. Inside, someone eventually picked up the album. I would learn later that it was my mother. She had wanted a photo of the gifts before dinner was cleared, something sentimental to post, something that showed abundance and gratitude. She opened the leather cover smiling, already prepared to be pleased. The first few pages confused her. Photos she didn't recognize. Places she didn't remember. My face, older, younger, steady, appearing again and again in moments she had never attended. She frowned, flipping faster, the smile fading into concentration. My father leaned in, curious, then quiet. Around them, conversation continued for a few seconds longer, unaware. Daniel noticed when the room changed temperature. He looked over, irritation crossing his face at the interruption, then impatience when he saw the album wasn't about him. He reached for it, laughing lightly, ready to dismiss whatever it was. That laugh didn't last. His fingers stilled on the pages where the numbers began. Bank statements don't need explanation. Dates don't argue. Patterns speak for themselves. He tried to joke again, softer this time, but no one laughed with him. My mother's hand started to shake. She asked a question no one answered. My father sat back in his chair, the color draining from his face, as he read line after line he didn't want to understand. Around them, people began to notice. A cousin leaned closer. A friend stopped mid-sentence. The band hesitated, then fell silent altogether. The room, once loud and celebratory, turned attentive in that dangerous way that comes just before something breaks. Daniel stood up too quickly, his chair scraping the floor. He said my name like it was an accusation, like a defense, like a threat. "This is a misunderstanding," he insisted, too loudly. "She doesn't know what she's talking about." But I wasn't there to argue. The pages didn't need me. My father finally spoke, his voice low, unfamiliar. He asked a question Daniel couldn't answer without lying, and lying no longer worked. People don't explode when they're exposed. They unravel. The confidence drains first. Then the certainty. Daniel's voice grew sharp, then brittle. He reached for the album, tried to close it, but my mother pulled it back, something like grief flickering across her face. Not for me. For the image she was losing. For the son she thought she knew. For the story she had built her life around. Someone whispered. Then another. Phones appeared quietly, not raised yet, but ready. The bride stood frozen beside Daniel, her smile gone, her hands clasped too tightly together. She hadn't known. Or maybe she had, and chosen not to look. Either way, the truth didn't care. It spread naturally, efficiently, without spectacle. I started the engine before the shouting began. I didn't need to hear it. I knew the sound of denial well enough to recognize it from memory. As I pulled away, headlights sweeping over gravel and pine, I felt no rush of victory, no surge of triumph. Just relief. The kind that settles deep in your bones when you finally put something down you've been carrying far too long. By the time I reached the highway, my phone began to buzz.
Once. Twice.
Again and again. I didn't check it. I didn't need to know who was calling or what they wanted to say. I had spent my entire life listening. Tonight, I chose silence for myself. The drive was long and quiet, mountains giving way to open road, darkness slowly thinning toward morning. With every mile, the image of the hallway chair faded. The smell of cleaner and coats loosened its grip on my memory. I thought about how carefully I had learned to take up less space, how that skill had once kept me safe. And I understood, finally, that it had also kept me trapped. I reached my apartment just as the sky began to lighten. Inside, everything was exactly where I'd left it.
No tensión.
No performance. I hung my dress over a chair and noticed how unremarkable it looked in the morning light. Just fabric, no longer armor. My phone buzzed again. This time, a message slipped through on the lock screen. "We didn't know. Please call." It was my mother. The words were familiar. She had used them my entire life. "We didn't know." As if not knowing absolved everything. I turned the phone face down. Later that morning, I booked a short trip somewhere I had never been, a place with water and quiet and no history attached to my name. It felt indulgent and necessary at the same time. On the balcony, coffee cooling in my hands, I watched the city wake up.
Cars moved.
People hurried. Life continued, indifferent to family dramas and long-held resentments. It struck me then how small my role had always been in their story, and how large my life could be without it. I don't know what happened at the estate after I left. I don't know how long the guests stayed, or who said what to whom. I know only that something ended there that night, and something else began far away from the chandeliers and speeches. For the first time, silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like space. If you've ever been placed at the edge of the room, told without words that you mattered less, understand this. Walking away isn't weakness. It's not failure. Sometimes it's the most honest response you have. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I didn't demand to be seen. I simply left the truth where it could no longer be ignored and chose myself instead. And in that quiet choice, I finally became free. The next few days felt surreal. News of what had happened at the wedding spread through family groups, whispered conversations, and social media posts, but I didn't check any of it. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for validation, explanations, or apologies. The world could see the truth without my intervention, and I didn't need to witness the fallout. My life had finally moved out from behind the glass of a ballroom I'd never truly entered. Every step I took away from that estate felt lighter, the weight of years of silence and erasure peeling off like old wallpaper. At the apartment, I unpacked nothing more than a small bag I'd taken with me. The one that carried my dress, the album, and a few personal items. Everything else, the resentment, the years of being overlooked, the invisible role I had been forced into, remained behind, somewhere under chandeliers and the carefully curated happiness of a family that had failed to notice me. I sat at my kitchen table with a coffee that had grown lukewarm and let myself breathe, for the first time without anticipating judgment or interruption. The silence was unfamiliar, yes, but it wasn't empty. It was full of something I had long denied myself: space. I thought about Daniel. I imagined him back at the estate, realizing the extent of exposure, feeling the consequences of decisions he had assumed were invisible. But I felt no satisfaction. Not triumph, not glee, not revenge. That would have tethered me to the same cycles I had spent my life escaping. Instead, I felt a quiet certainty. The truth had done its work, and now it was no longer my burden. I had left it carefully placed, deliberate, yet silent. It would speak for itself. That was enough. Weeks passed, and the city slowly reclaimed me. Mornings smelled of coffee and wet asphalt. Evenings shimmered with headlights glancing across rain-slick streets. I explored parks and riversides, places I had once imagined visiting but never felt allowed to enjoy, always tethered to obligations, expectations, and the constant pull of family approval. Now each step was mine. I walked without permission, without guilt, without hesitation. Each mile I traveled carried me farther from a life where my worth had always been measured in the shadows of someone else's spotlight. Eventually, I returned home to my apartment with a sense of calm I had never known. The city hummed around me, indifferent and steady. I realized I didn't need explanations or reconciliations. I didn't need recognition or restitution. I had finally acknowledged myself. My life wasn't defined by those who had ignored or erased me, nor by the drama of exposure or humiliation. My life was defined by the simple act of choosing to walk away, by choosing to exist for myself rather than in the margins of others' narratives. Sometimes, when I pass a crowded street or hear laughter echoing through an event hall, I feel a faint echo of the girl I used to be, the one who learned to be small, quiet, unnoticed. I honor her by remembering the lessons she taught me, that silence can be strength, that walking away can be power, and that freedom often comes not from confrontation but from release. I no longer fear absence. I no longer fear being overlooked. I've learned to thrive in the spaces I carve for myself, spaces I control, spaces I deserve. In the end, it wasn't the scream, the confrontation, or the humiliation that mattered. It was the quiet moment in the hallway, the weight of the gift in my hands, the deliberate choice to leave truth where it could no longer be ignored, and the decision to step out into the world unbound. For the first time in my life, I didn't just exist, I was fully present, fully myself. And as I watch the sun rise over water I've never known, I understand that the loudest revenge, the truest liberation, is simply walking away and claiming the life you've always deserved. Sometimes, family doesn't see you. Sometimes, those who should protect you are the ones who keep you small. And sometimes, you have to step quietly into your own life, let the world take notice without a sound, and discover that freedom has always been waiting for you.